Metroid Prime 3 is one of the most linear entries in the entire Metroid series. Serving as the grand finale to the Phazon story arc, Prime 3 placed a greater emphasis on its narrative, with higher stakes and more involved characters. Unfortunately, this decision came at the cost of the sprawling, interconnected map design and isolated atmosphere seen in the first two Prime games, as Prime 3 de-emphasized map exploration in favor of linear levels laden with corridors, just filled with enemies to gun down. All the while, the supporting cast regales you with unskippable reminders of your next objective. Its railroading spans so much of the experience that it's unpalatable to a Metroid fan who values replayability and non-linearity. But that might not have been how Prime 3 was meant to turn out. Originally, the game was planned to feature a sort of open-world traversal system, using Samus's gunship to fly through space and hunt actual bounties, breaking away from Metroid's usual progression. As Prime 3's senior producer Brian Walker recounts, the open world was more of a hub area that would have existed between the different planets and this particular side content. Of course, this idea never made it out of the planning stages. Some remnants of it can still be found in the final game, but the idea of a central hub zone and gunship exploration were shelved once it became clear how much it'd impact the cost, scope, and length of Prime 3's development. Though it was an idea too ambitious for the Nintendo of 2007, the newly released Metroid Prime 4 offers a small glimpse into what this idea might have looked like. Following the initial enthusiasm towards Prime 4's announcement in 2017, there were understandable concerns whether the game would be a worthy successor to the original trilogy. Between the development restart and key members of the original trilogy long having left Retro, it was unclear whether the Retro studios of a new era could recapture what made the original trilogy work so well. But for me personally, my biggest question going into Prime 4 wasn't about the new story or any aesthetic concerns. I wanted to know how its progression was going to be handled. Though the first three Prime games are similar in many ways, their worlds are all structured fairly differently. Prime 1 has a sprawling, interconnected world typically reliant on central hub rooms to branch off into different sections of its varied areas. It's essentially a 3D version of how Super Metroid's areas were designed, using these central rooms as landmarks for players to better orient themselves in the world by breaking it down into distinct chunks. Prime 2's world design is more compartmentalized by comparison, using an entire region as a central hub area to connect the game's three major areas together. It makes for more of a restrictive, formulaic experience compared to Prime 1, since you're forced to tackle these three areas in a linear order, but the areas themselves are sprawling enough that it still feels like you're exploring a vast, interconnected world. Prime 3 goes further with this approach, segmenting its different areas into different planets. You never have to consider how these different areas connect to each other, because they literally don't. Much of the decision-making used for navigation in prior games has been stripped away, as the linear level design either funnels you to your next destination or leaves little room for other options. Whether it was a conscious decision or simply the product of circumstance, it's pretty clear the Prime series progressively became more linear over time. So, what of Prime 4? Does it continue this gradual shift towards linearity, or does Retro's inclusion of an open world offer something new compared to its predecessors? Hi, my name is not Mark Brown, and this isn't Game Maker's Toolkit. I don't know when he'll get around to doing it himself, so my video about Metroid Prime 4's world design is gonna have to do in the meantime.
Samus! I've been waiting for this.
Much like prior games, Prime 4 initially starts off with a brisk tutorial area meant to ease you into the experience, followed by a short jaunt into Chrono Tower to set the stage. It's here where you're given a key item and your main objective, before being hurriedly whisked off into the game's first major area. Logically, this should be where Prime 4 starts to open up. Around the same point in prior games, you'd be in Chozo Ruins and the end of Temple Grounds, while Prime 3's tutorial sequence would still be dragging along through GFS Olympus. Unfortunately, it soon becomes clear that Fury Green doesn't offer the same breadth of exploration seen in the opening areas of Prime 1 and 2. In fact, its layout is just a straight line with a single turn, with only a few one-room detours strewn about. By the time you beat Carvex and get your first key, it's obvious that you're still in Prime 4's tutorial sequence, as Miles McKenzie, the best character in the game, continues chattering and pointing out the obvious along the way.
From what I gather, the only way off this planet is to retrieve 5 teleporter keys.
Afterwards, you're catapulted towards the game's second major area, Vault Forge, where Prime 4 should really, truly start opening up. But Vault Forge is still extremely linear. Not only does Miles explicitly outline your route and objective, but there's a little to do besides follow the elevators to the base of the towers. Though Vault Forge is saved by a more interesting layout, spread out across 3 separate towers. There's a nice sense of variety and meaningful progression as you restore power to the forge, using the Viola bike to cross over into other structures. It definitely gives the area a much bigger sense of scale and helps ease players into Prime 4's newest gameplay mechanic. You'll eventually unlock the Viola's core features through an exhaustive tutorial, get the second teleporter key, and finally gain access to Soul Valley, the hub area connecting Viros's different regions together. By this point, you're 1/3 of the way through your main goal, with 2 of the game's 5 major areas being extremely linear, drawn-out tutorials. Around this same time, you would have likely entered Magmoor Caverns in Prime 1, been well into Aegon Wastes in Prime 2, and finally gotten past Prime 3's absurdly long intro sequence, touching down on planet Brio. Upon arriving at Soul Valley, Mackenzie points out that it's up to you to decide which of the remaining keys you want to track down first, suggesting that Prime 4 really does open up around this point. With so much freedom now laid at your feet, it's easy to assume that Prime 4's open world structure might take cues from recent Zelda releases, giving you all the required tools early on and letting you pick your own route through the rest of the game. Maybe these upcoming areas are larger and more dense, filled with different routes and upgrades dependent upon the order in which you tackle them. Unfortunately, Mackenzie's initial suggestion to choose your own path is an outright lie. There's not only an order in which these areas must be visited in, but insurmountable progression barriers make it an order that you can't deviate from. If the remaining areas were more open and sprawling, the forced linearity could maybe be overlooked. But Prime 4's world traversal rarely evolves past Vault Forge. Ice Belt, Flare Pool, and Great Mines all rely heavily on scripted sequences, railroaded level design, and constant firefights. The streamlined level design just makes the game's constant guides towards your next objective feel patronizing. And these hints can't be disabled, unlike the optional hint systems of Prime 1 and 2. The areas themselves aren't much larger than what came before either, containing few branching paths, minimal verticality, and almost no real decision making. There are definitely still things to find off the beaten path, but the beaten path used to be multiple paths that'd fork off again and again. These areas are so linear that it almost makes Samus's ever-upgrading arsenal feel underutilized on the main path of progression. Not only does Prime 4's aggressive railroading and hand-holding run contrary to what most Metroid fans associate the series with, but it's also contrary to how Nintendo's other major series have been recently emphasizing complete player freedom within open-ended levels. Especially when you consider Prime 4 has a central open-ended area of its own. In an age where it's proven you can still sell games built around letting players explore and die at their leisure, I'm not sure why Prime 4 is so afraid to trust the player. It's the very same issue that permeated nearly the entirety of Prime 3, even worse in some ways. Sure, it helps accommodate newcomers, but it ultimately hurts the game's replayability when your agency as a player is constantly being interrupted when it matters most. Prime 4's design is so incredibly rigid that one of its biggest sequence breaks doesn't actually yield immediate results, because trying to activate the item outside the intended order will softlock the game. While most sequence breaks usually aren't intended by the developers, it's obvious they can add a lot of replay value. As a fan who loves the gameplay options they provide, seeing Retro continue cracking down on them is incredibly disappointing. So if Prime 4's progression is heavily restrictive, does Soul Valley offer anything to compensate for the lack of meaningful exploration? After all, the reveal of an open world in Metroid was initially met with confusion and vitriol, as such a wide open space would clash with the series' focus on exploring tightly designed, interconnected rooms. And yeah, the doubters were pretty much right. While I was open to the idea prior to Prime 4's release, that open-mindedness was predicated upon the hope that Soul Valley would offer more than an empty open world, something the game never really delivers on. Soul Valley itself serves the same role as a hub world like Hyrule Field and Ocarina of Time, except its design is closer to the Hyrule seen in Breath of the Wild, with a sense of scale so large it necessitated the inclusion of a dedicated vehicle. I actually respect Retro's commitment to the series' unbroken world design by not including any inorganic fast travel options, as with most traditional open world games, but Soul Valley is simply too big for the content it has to offer. Aside from major areas on the edges of the map, there's only a scant few Galactic Federation outposts, optional shrines, and a slew of green crystals scattered throughout the world. I think Prime 4 expects players to spend a good bit of time in the open world between major areas, given the flagrant backtracking and a prerequisite amount of green crystals to simply beat the game, which is a separate problem in itself. Despite having the appearance of a common open world collectible, these crystals are directly tied to the Prime series' traditional artifact hunt, perhaps in a misguided attempt to justify the inclusion of an open world. There is a passing mention of how important these crystals are to preserving the Lemorne's legacy, but they're otherwise presented as an optional collectible rather than the significant items they truly are. The disconnect is so bad that I've seen people assume the crystals aren't important, only to discover later on that yes, you have to collect the green crystals in the open hub. And sure, there's expansions and upgrades hidden behind shrines and elemental gates to further incentivize exploration of Soul Valley, but it's hard to shake the feeling that all of its content would have been better off integrated into the levels themselves. But to Prime 4's credit, Soul Valley is supposed to be an arid sea of lifelessness. The game's entire story hinges upon the Lemorne's efforts to revitalize Viros's barren ecosystem, and I think Soul Valley does a great job presenting the planet as an oppressively empty wasteland. There's no music, almost no wildlife, and no settlements of any kind, only a haunting wail as the winds blow through the sand. It's a powerful, chilling atmosphere, but not every game can pull off an empty world like Shadow of the Colossus did. The Forbidden Land was far more scenic, with varied terrain and architecture on your travels to the next Colossi, and the entire game was in service of this emptiness. Even on its own merits, Soul Valley just isn't that interesting to actually explore. Now, I thought we'd have to wait years to better understand why Prime 4 turned out this way, but on Christmas Day, of all days, Famitsu released an interview about Prime 4 with an unnamed Nintendo developer, likely the Prime series producer Kensuke Tanabe. The interview is surprisingly transparent about Prime 4's development, revealing that many of its concepts predate the development restart in 2019, including psychic abilities and the open hub area. The reason for this open hub area has no relation to Prime 3's original concept. It was directly influenced by the glowing reception to Breath of the Wild, which released only 3 months prior to Prime 4's initial announcement. The basic structure seen in the final game was decided upon very early on, but development wasn't going well. After making the call to restart Prime 4's development, Nintendo decided against scrapping literally everything, instead opting to continue building upon this original foundation. Remember, about 18 months of time and money were already invested into Prime 4. Preserving as much of that work as possible was likely the most efficient and financially sound decision at the time. Even for big companies like Nintendo, you generally don't want to scrap everything unless there's truly no chance of a return on that investment. Unfortunately, Prime 4's development had taken so long that by the time Nintendo realized public reception to open world games was shifting, it was far too late to pivot away. Though the interview suggests Retro was encouraged to implement their own original ideas, they were ultimately shackled to an outline they had no part in drafting. And while Prime 4 does in fact have an 8-year development cycle, the interview also confirms that a chunk of this time was spent building Retro back up to handle the task. Various secondhand reports have touched on how Retro spent the years following Tropical Freeze's release floundering their newfound creative freedom, trying to get their own original IP, Harmony, off the ground. It's possible that the absence of Kensuke Tanabe, Retro's long-standing producer, was a key factor in these development issues. Ultimately, Nintendo cancelled Harmony around 2017, and later reassigned Retro to remaster the Metroid Prime trilogy, a move partially done to help Retro develop a better production pipeline. There was a time when rumors of these remasters were so abundant it became a running joke. According to a Reset Era post made around then, Retro was supposedly split between the Prime remaster and assisting with Prime 4's troubled development as a support studio. Allegedly, their work on both projects was so promising that it led to the executive decision to restart development with Retro at the helm instead. Though never officially confirmed, it's been long reported the original developer they replaced was Bandai Namco's Singapore studio, who themselves was later replaced by Bamco's in-house Japan studio during development. This might be why Prime Remastered itself has so many support studios credited on the project, as not only did Retro have yet to finish Prime Remastered, they also had to make Prime 4's grand scope work on the Switch 1, go on a mass hiring spree to recruit the necessary talent, and eventually manage it through a global pandemic in the middle of it all. The fact Prime 4 even managed to come out is a miracle in its own right. Of course, a lot of these rumor details run deeper than what I have outlined here, but the pieces all seem to fit together nicely, better contextualizing the game's troubled development. Though even knowing that it was Nintendo, probably Kensuke Tanabe himself, who was responsible for Prime 4's hub world, I think it's still fair to question its implementation. Linear level design and open world design both have their strengths and weaknesses, but Prime 4's efforts to marry the two somehow leads the game to embody the weakest aspects of both, with an open world that offers little and levels that stifle any sense of player agency. The Galactic Federation outposts really exemplify this, as you have the freedom to drive to them at any point like a normal open world game, but their rewards are largely inaccessible without later upgrades, like a traditional Metroid game. Sure, revisiting previously inaccessible areas is part of Metroid's core appeal, but it doesn't feel great that most of the content in the open world they want you to explore isn't accessible until late game. As a reminder, the aforementioned Famitsu interview admitted that Metroid's core design philosophy is hard to preserve in an open world environment. And to be clear, it's very possible to marry linear level design with open-ended progression. The recently released Angeline Era is proof that these two schools of thought can be combined to form a compelling gameplay loop. It works in Angeline Era because these two aspects of the game are carefully designed to feed back into each other constantly. The implementation seen in Prime 4 feels a lot more slapdash, and it's not easy trying to make these two halves work without redoing the whole concept. For every upgrade or expansion you hide in the open world to make it worthy of the player's time, you take away content that could have been put into the areas themselves. The more you focus on fleshing out those areas, the less relevant the open world becomes. If Nintendo was really so adamant on committing to this world design for Prime 4, they really should have made the hub world a proper area unto itself. Rather than a vast desert, it would have been better to focus on a smaller location that encapsulated Metroid's core design, with its own niches and hidden rooms to find as you cut through it to reach new areas. That is essentially what the temple grounds in Prime 2 are. Building upon that idea would fulfill the same purpose and better fit with Metroid's core design. Realistically, Voltforge could have served this purpose, since it has Viola sections and multiple structures to explore on foot, along with numerous shortcuts unlocked by later upgrades. When excluding Fury Green, it's also the area you're forced to revisit the most. Expanding this into a dense central hub with tons of shortcuts and hidden areas would have been a much better fit for Metroid than an open world. And if Prime 4 absolutely had to have an open world, there were still other avenues to explore. Shrinking the map size and taking cues from Sonic Frontier's open zone design would have assuaged a lot of issues by turning Soul Valley into more of a dense sandbox for Samus's tools to be used in. The point is, there are better ways to implement this idea of a central hub area than to lean into open world game design. Soul Valley just doesn't mesh with Metroid's core gameplay structure. Its presentation as an open-ended environment gives players the illusion of choice, as its freeform design is strangled by the game's railroading. At best, it's harmless and kinda atmospheric. At worst, it's padding that's an active detriment to Prime 4's full potential. Now, there's still more that could be said about Prime 4 beyond its progression, such as its stylistic differences compared to the original trilogy or how well it works as a self-contained installment, but that's outside the scope of this video. A lesser man would make a video titled, "I hate Metroid Prime 4!" That's just a thinly veiled excuse to nitpick for hours on end. But not only are those types of videos just bad, but I think there's elements of Prime 4 that suggest Retro can still make a standout experience. The core gameplay remains just as strong and enjoyable, with the elemental chip system being the best of the series' efforts to iterate on Prime 1's beam system. Though much of the game's structure is an echo of Prime 3, the gameplay itself feels much more focused and less like a glorified Wii tech demo. Boss fights are great overall, with the Silex encounters being a consistent highlight. Retro needs to build more upon this new grapple system. It has so much potential for combat and exploration. The same goes for the new spider ball mechanics. They can make some real nasty morph ball puzzles with these, I can feel it. Prime 4 also still has an abundance of world building and intriguing lore. There's an underlying theme of loss and reconciliation at the core of Prime 4's narrative, as seen in the Lemorreans' efforts to prevent their self-induced extinction. It's only after abandoning efforts to reverse the damage and accepting responsibility that they're able to move on and find a way for their people to live on in some way. Even Silex himself reinforces this theme, being responsible for the death of his own troops and seemingly still overcome with grief, unable to move on or accept responsibility for his own actions, projecting his blame onto Samus and the Federation instead. I agree that he should have been used more, but I think there's more to him than people are willing to give credit for. Though I feel the implementation of the side characters could have been better, they remain some of the most fleshed out in the series. Tokabi in particular is a huge standout, embodying the best of Prime 4's writing, leaning into more of a subdued tone that's a great fit for Metroid. If future entries continue focusing on Samus's interactions with Federation troops, this is how I prefer to see it handled.
I have made mistakes, many mistakes, but through Solon's light, I find balance.
The presentation is wonderful, with some of the best music in the series and striking, yonic imagery present all throughout the game. When you're actually allowed to wander around and take in these environments on your own time, they're genuinely breathtaking and among the series' best. It's also a technical marvel for a Switch 1 game, to the point I actually forget it's not a Switch 2 exclusive. Credit should go where it's due, and I feel there's a lot Prime 4 does get right. It's clear that many of its best ideas are Retro making the most of the circumstances imposed upon them, and I agree that the final result doesn't feel like a game that spent almost a full decade in development hell. The low points are frustrating, but when it all comes together, it still feels like Metroid Prime. That moment right there. That's why I can't humor the claims that Prime 4 isn't Metroid, because Metroid has been many different things at different points in time. Is it that feeling of getting lost in an unfamiliar world? Feelings of isolation and fear that thrive off show, don't tell? Flexible progression that allows for tons of replay value? Some indefinable combination of all three? Everyone has their own idea of what's integral to Metroid's identity or what they value most about the series. I think that's part of why this has been the most divisive entry to date among actual Metroid fans. Those who value hands-off exploration, sequence breaks, or isolation will likely be disappointed. Those who had no issues with Prime 3's set-piece-driven formula will probably be more at home here. If you've seen my other Metroid videos, you can probably tell which side of the divide I'm on. I don't begrudge Prime 4 for trying something different, because every part of the original trilogy, if not Metroid overall, experimented with the formula and still proved themselves as worthy entries. Prime 4 didn't need to be Metroid Prime 1 again, like how Prime 2 and 3 didn't need to be Prime 1 either. Unfortunately, Prime 4 never quite realizes its full potential. If anything, it wasn't experimental enough, playing its new ideas too safe. Again, I understand a lot of that is owed to the game's rocky development. It's far from the first time a Metroid game was marred by developmental issues, but it's the first time they significantly compromised the final product. At times, you can see signs they probably had more planned with Prime 4. There's still Miles' original line about the remaining 3 keys, this random save point in Soul Valley, all these shortcuts in Volt Forge that are only available after you're truly done with the area, and half an hour of unused dialogue between the Federation members.
You ever do any arm wrestling?
I have not.
I think it could be an easy way to make some Saguru on the side.
By the way, Saguru is an in-universe currency that's only ever been mentioned in the official Metroid manga. A lot can be levied at Prime 4, but Retro clearly did their homework. Maybe we'd be singing a different song if Retro was able to fully realize these ideas, or if Prime 4's world design was closer to what the old Retro studios envisioned for Prime 3. But then, their idea never made it to retail to avoid the core issues that plagued Prime 4's development. The cost, work, and time required to realize such an ambitious scope was simply too high. We've seen this time and again with other games, like Monster Hunter Wilds, which sacrificed so much in pursuit of the very same seamless experience. and arguably turned out worse for doing so. Prime 4 could have turned out so much worse, and the fact it didn't is why I think this new team at Retro still has a lot of potential. There likely will be a Metroid Prime 5 in the future, and if it focuses more on the exploration of a tightly interconnected world, with varied level design, better enemy variety, and tighter pacing, I think this new team could easily have a game capable of standing alongside the first two Primes. Though given the recent news that Prime 4 will be the last title produced by Kensuke Tanabe, with Risa Tabata poised to take his place as series producer, who really knows what the future holds? One can only hope that it won't take us nearly a decade to find out. But when that time comes, please just let us turn forced hints off in Prime 5!
Have you explored Full Forge using your new abilities?
Oh my god, dude, I know where to go already!